Thanks for coming to our forum this morning. I'd like to open this up with a word of prayer. May the Lord be with you. Let us pray. God of grace, God of new beginnings, God of love, hope, and faith, we come before you here now in this faith formation forum to learn and to grow. We ask you to bless our guest speaker, Dr. Rubenstein. Lord, bless him and keep him. And God, may we hear what he has to say with open minds, open hearts, to process, to learn, and grow closer to each other, closer to you, closer to your ways of grace for the world. Lord, we lift up these prayers. In Jesus' name, amen. I turn it over to Debbie Larson as an introduction.
Thank you all for coming. I can tell by the numbers of people here that we have lots of questions and opinions about this very politically charged concept. Critical race theory, that acronym has kind of developed its own meaning lately. So I am very hopeful that Dr. Rubenstein can give us good information so that when we engage with our peers and our family over the next few days and weeks, we'll be able to do so in a more informed way. So Dr. Rubenstein, and I have bios passed already.
Let's give him a hand and welcome.
Thank you. I've been liberated from my mask. I'm told. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for asking me. And it's a beautiful room. I'm very happy to be standing in it. I want to say hello to you from my colleagues and friends at the George Mason University Jimmy Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution, where I work, and I have worked for the past 35 years. It's very good to be back in this part of town, too, since I raised my family here in Fairfax, not too far from where we are right now. So we have an interesting subject to talk about this morning, and I'll try to keep my remarks fairly short so that we can have plenty of time for discussion. And the first question is, so what are we discussing exactly? And that is a problem with this particular subject, critical race theory. So let's sort of divide the discussion, if you like, into two parts. One part will be about critical race theory, what it is. It's a body of thinking, knowledge, of conversation, done by people who don't necessarily agree with each other all the time, by the way, at all. And I'll say a little something about what critical race theory means, or what the basic principles of it are. There's a lot to read about this, as you know. If you go online and Google it, you'll know it pretty much as much as I do, about what the theory says. And the second question is about the controversy about the theory. What's behind that controversy is one way to look at the question, but I prefer to actually look at it another way, to ask if we decide that critical race theory actually has something to say that's true about race relations in the United States and about American history, and about the way our society operates, then the second question is, how do we talk about that with people who don't necessarily agree with it, or who feel threatened by it, and who, I may say, have reason to feel threatened by it in some ways. So let's divide it. I will then follow my own agenda here and divide this in two. First, what is critical race theory all about? Well, as you may know, it's a theory that actually developed among a very small kind of almost esoteric group of thinkers, some of whom I know, because they come from Harvard Law School where I spent some time. And they developed critical race theory really on the basis of a pre-existing theory, which had nothing directly to do with race, called critical legal studies. Some of the critical legal studies people, many of them were at Harvard to begin with, developed a critique of American legal institutions, which was based really on the notion that although law and legal reform can do some very good things for lots of people at various times, law in itself is part of a larger structure. In fact, we and everybody else live in societies which are structured in the sense that there are patterns of thought and behavior that are generated over time and that are related to structures of power. Patterns of thought and behavior which generally reinforce the power of the powerful and the subordination of the less powerful. So critical legal studies people were people who were, in philosophical terms, those of you who know about this work, are sometimes called legal realists, but they went a step further and became legal structuralists and developed a critique of legal institutions which basically said, let's go ahead doing the legal reforms that we think are important to try to secure justice for everybody in our society, but recognize that the system in some ways has loaded the deck in favor of the economically powerful, the politically powerful, and the culturally powerful. And when we talk about social structures, we very often have in mind that these structures operate on the socioeconomic level, on the political level, and on the cultural level. So that theory was of great interest to some people and some students, and it didn't get a hell of a lot of publicity, actually. It excited some people, including me, when I was younger. But then there came along some folks, including a friend of mine, Derek Bell, who was a professor at Harvard, who said, wait a minute, can't you say the same thing about race and race relations and the law concerning race? A case like Brown versus Board of Education is a remarkable piece of legal and social progress. It had very important social effects. But in the larger scheme of things, it's also true, Bell said, that structurally speaking, looking at the economy, looking at the way the political system operates, looking at the way cultural attitudes are formed, racism is still alive and well in America. And then the question for the legal reformers is therefore, what kind of legal reforms will lead in the direction of system change? What kind of legal reforms won't be considered a be-all and end-all in themselves, creating equality of opportunity, when actually there is not equality of opportunity? What else has to be done in society to make this a just society and to make anti-racism a norm? Well, you can see already that this then provides the basis for later generations of scholars and activists to think about what the nature of race relations is in the U.S. and also what has to be done to transform it in the direction of justice for all. The critical race theorists emphasized a few points that I think are important, both because what they say is important and also because of the way they're interpreted or misinterpreted then can produce controversy. For example, one thing critical race theorists all agree on is that race itself is largely a social construction. It's a social construction. There are physical characteristics that people have that give rise to racial classification and racial labeling. Well, if you look around this room, you'll see a lot of these people in this room would probably be classified as white. Right? But if you really look at what their color is, you'll see some of them are pink, and some of them are more swarthy, and some of them are kind of a yellowish tinge to the skin. But they're all classified white, and that classification is something that people have accepted for historical reasons, for political reasons, and also for power-based reasons. It's a political classification, in other words. To call all people who are actually lots of different colors white is a political classification. And it goes back to the days when, in the United States, when people were trying to decide who was black and who was white based on their parentage. When I say that it's a construction, this may raise a few eyebrows, but I recall very well, I read about this when I was in school myself, and I, in some ways, lived it. There was a time in the United States, and after the First World War, when there was a commission appointed by Congress, which claimed to be a scientific commission, to inquire into the problem that newer immigrants to America, newer in the sense of, in those days, meant immigrants from Russia, immigrants from Poland, immigrants from Italy, people from Southern and Eastern Europe, many of whom were Catholics and many of whom were Jews. And the question that Congress wanted to ask was, why don't they make such good Americans? Why is there so much crime among these people? And why is there so much mental illness among these people? And why do they keep speaking their own language instead of learning English? Why aren't they as good Americans as the people who came from Northern Europe before them? Honestly, this was the question that Congress asked. And the answer involved scientific studies done by people who were considered scientific authorities at the time, which, among other things, suggested that one of the reasons the immigrants weren't making such good Americans was that they weren't white. They were swarthy. They were kind of not black exactly, but they were, not white exactly either. And in fact, I did some writing about this history myself, and I have letters in my files where people, in one letter, a California farmer asks another farmer, and pardon the bad language, but he says, do you think that a Dago is a white man? Dago is a bad word for an Italian. So the whole question of what race you are was linked at an early period with what kind of power you had or didn't have, and what kind of social status and what kind of prestige you had or didn't have. So that's sort of the opening gun of the critical race theory. Let's remember that race is a construction, and that the way that construction takes place is dictated largely by political and power-based considerations. The second thing they said was these political and power-based considerations are part of the structure of American society. They're part of the structure of every society. And in the United States, they're part of the structure of a society which, from a very early period, favored the interests of white settlers over Native Americans and over slaves who were brought into to work the fields. So behind this, you can see the kind of the reasoning taking place that you had slavery, and slavery was a legal status, but also a political and a cultural status. And we had a civil war, terrible civil war, casualty rate, by the way, in that war, the numbers of deaths has recently been raised to over 700,000 Americans killed in the Civil War. Not civilians, by the way, very few of them civilians, most of them soldiers, but just a bloodbath, which ended slavery. And when slavery ended, the northern whites justifiably congratulated themselves on having made incredible sacrifices in order to end that, what the Southerners called their peculiar institution. And everybody sat back and relaxed. Well, they couldn't relax to begin with because right after the Civil War, the United States was subjected to probably the most effective terrorist campaign in history that I know of. The Ku Klux Klan and other similar groups, white power groups, rebelled against the new order that the Reconstruction Congress had imposed on the South, and through using violence and threats of violence, after a struggle that lasted until 1876, the election of 1876, forced a withdrawal of northern troops from the South and enabled the South to do what it had already started to do politically, return to white political control. As you probably know, black people were terrorized into not voting, and their white supporters were either terrorized, driven out of the region, or killed. This campaign sometimes is not considered under the category under the heading of terrorism when we talk about wars on terrorism and so forth, but it was tremendously effective. And combining that with that military and political activity, combining with an economic system which transferred the blacks in the South from the status of slavery to the status of sharecroppers for most of them. Economic oppression continued despite the end of slavery. Political oppression in some senses even was worse because of the need to terrorize, the felt need to terrorize the non-white population to submission. And culturally, the justifications for this kind of behavior, for this kind of power structure, which my friend Johan Galton, the Norwegian peacemaker, calls cultural violence. This cultural violence continued so that the mythologies of the happy black slave who just wants to sing and dance were projected further into the Reconstruction period and even beyond. And the counter mythology, if you like, or the opposite mythology of the non-white person as a sexual predator and criminal, as a danger to society, was also continued and pushed forward, and it's alive and well today, as I'm sure you know. So that when you looked around, you saw the end of slavery, which was a great thing, but you also saw the continuation of behaviors that were structurally conditioned. That is to say, which were emanating from a power structure and the needs of that power structure to maintain itself. So racism, in one sense, ended, in another sense, had new life. And the critical legal studies, the critical race theory people are saying that has been the story. That is to say, the story continues that there are very important reforms, progress is made, but structurally linked racism in the form of economic, political, and cultural discrimination or inequality continues. So that's the second important point. The third important point that the critical race theorists were making had to do with the difficulty of coming to terms with historic injustice which has a structural base. What do you do when you are a white person living a decent life, struggling, as most people do, to make a living, to keep a family together, to do the right thing socially and politically, and you are you are tempted to say, well, we have a new set of problems now. We have climate change to worry about. We have globalization and its good and bad effects to worry about. We have plagues and natural disasters of various kinds to worry about. At least we don't have to worry about race the way we used to. That's over. We are the phrase was post-racist. And the answer some critical race theorists gave to this, which then proved to be extremely controversial, was, and I'm sorry, white people, you can't sit back and declare this war over. Because the position you occupy in the country is, relatively speaking, to those who were ultra-oppressed, who were actually enslaved, and then after slavery had to suffer all the consequences of slavery, that privilege, that position is relatively privileged. And even though you may think absolutely correctly that you are trying hard to, even just to stay in place, no less to get ahead, and life for you is not easy. You're not privileged in the sense of having a silver spoon, being born with a silver spoon, or driving a Tesla or what have you. You are privileged relative to us, said the non-white theorist. You're privileged relative to us, and that's going to continue so long as you don't recognize the structural sources of the injustice. For example, if you look at the economy, you'll discover that not only are there pockets of transgenerational poverty, large pockets is too light a word, too small a word. Large areas, many of them urban areas, in which people basically are living the way poorer people in the third world live. Places in which there are no good jobs to be had, so you have to get an illegal job if you want to feed your family. Places in which the schools don't teach. Places in which public services just don't reach you. Places in which you're exposed to police violence in the way that most people who are not people of color don't get exposed to, and so on and so forth. And no doubt this is also true of areas that are white areas, poor white areas in the South and in deindustrializing states are also suffering. But the suffering of black people in the cities, as a friend of mine said in Chicago, where I used to teach and work, he said, you folks, your government has promised us a new deal, a new economic deal in the inner city for the last 50 years. But the only people who've delivered on that is the drug business. And we're still waiting for that Marshall Plan for the cities. Right? So then when you look at wealth statistics, and I'm not going to bore you with a lot of statistics, but basically people of color have not been in a position to accumulate wealth as opposed to income wealth. And the wealth figures are just astonishing. So you can look and talk about socioeconomic inequality, and some of the critical race theorists do, although they tend, I must say, to talk more about politics and culture than about economics. And then you look at the political system, and you find progress being made there. People voting who are now voting because they're allowed to vote, right? But I mean, I was all grown up before there was a Voting Rights Act. This is new. There are still some severe problems in making a reality of black and brown political power, which we can talk about. And perhaps, in some ways, most painful of all, and the critical race theorists are registering this, attitudes and cultural norms that define people of color as inferior in one way or another continue, although they shift because it's no longer politically correct or morally correct to talk about people being members of an inferior race. It's still perfectly okay, in some circles at least, to talk about people being a criminal class. And Michelle Alexander, who's related to the critical race movement, has written a book that some of you may know called Mass Incarceration, the New Jim Crow, in which she says that for the United States and America to have more people in jail than any other country on earth at this point, including China and South Africa and other places, is related to the fact that there is such social inequality. We've had 3 presidential crime commissions already who say there's a link between poverty and crime. Not that poverty by itself causes crime or that all criminals are poor, but that there's a clear sociologically provable link between poverty and crime. And yet, this doesn't prevent us from treating poor people and people of means very differently when it comes to crime and punishment. Looking at these effects of the way social, cultural, political structures are operating, the critical race theory people have been saying, what we need to do is change the system. And that, for many of them, starts with talking to white people and getting them to recognize that this system that disfavors people of color favors them, even though they may not be feeling very favored. Perhaps where the theory got most explosive, and now let's go over and talk a little bit about the controversy over the theory. Where it got most explosive was when writers like Nicole Hannah-Jones, who writes for the New York Times, or did write for the New York Times, produces the 1619 Project. The 1619 Project was a kind of a survey of racism in America. And it started with allegations that by Nicole Hannah-Jones herself, that when one goes back into American history and looks at the founding, and the founding fathers and the founding mothers and all of that, one sees from the very beginning racist structures infecting and in some ways dominating the picture. So that if you ask, for example, why was there an American Revolution? Jones said in the original draft of her article, one important reason that there was an American Revolution against the British was that the British had abolished slavery. And were also standing in the way of the expansion of the white settler community in America, which would have meant an expansion of slavery. So that the same people, and then this becomes personalized in figures like Thomas Jefferson, the same people who preached equality and invented, in fact, democratic ideologies that are still very important to us, were, at the same time as they were talking that talk, they weren't walking the walk. They were either owning slaves or having relations with slaves, as Jefferson did, or doing things which whose ulterior motive was to make North America safe for slavery. And of course, the same thing could be said in terms of their relations to the Native Americans. That among the communities that were not very happy about the American Revolution was the American Indians, because the British, again, were to some extent were protecting them against colonial expansion. So this caused an explosion, because at this point, some of the critical race theorists were looking at icons of American democracy and people who were in some ways sacred figures in American history, and saying there's a dark side, if you will, to what they did, what they thought they were doing, and what they actually did. And at that point, it appeared to some people that they were besmirching the idols and the ideals of American history, and exaggerating also the extent to which the Democrats in word were not Democrats, in small d Democrats indeed. So when that was a flashpoint, right? When in terms of the controversy, and when a group of historians, including liberal historians, pointed out that Nicole Hannah-Jones seemed to be exaggerating the extent to which the American Revolution, among other things, was fought to preserve slavery, she then changed some keywords in her article, which you can read. By the way, it's online. Also, at her Nicole Hannah-Jones essay on the 1619 Project, in which she said some of the patriots were slave owners and wanted and saw the American Revolution as a way to protect their interest in slaves. And so she retracted from this was a basic cause of the revolution, although historians are still arguing about it. So, especially when we see the controversy in its forms, and by the way, if you want to read about it this morning, read the New York Times. There's an article in the first section about Loudoun County, the fight in Loudoun County over it doesn't mention critical race theory per se, but it mentions issues involving anti-racism programs in the schools and parents' objections that the anti-racist program. What are the objections? Right? The objections, and I don't want to go on too long now. I don't have my usual classroom clock to look at, so pardon me when I look at this. I'm sure you know what some of these objections are already, so I'll just mention them anyway. One objection is that critical race theory overemphasizes race as a factor in our social life and tends to kind of convert lots of other issues into racial issues. This causes loud objections on the part of people who say that the critical race theorists are trying to make whites guilty for being white. And that this sort of harping on black and white, connected with privilege and non-privilege, means that the critical race theorists are trying to get whites to feel guilty about their white privilege, or their so-called white skin privilege. And that some people are rejecting on the basis that some will say, I didn't own slaves. I have no prejudice against people of color. My family's not doing that great. Why should I feel guilty about anything? So that's number one. So stop telling me about white privilege and white skin privilege. That's been a major flashpoint. A second flashpoint has been, why are you talking about structure all the time and changing the system? That sounds like communism, or socialism, or some ism that I don't like. It sounds as if, at the very least, you're arguing for a much more active government role in making social change happen. And that we don't like. Some people don't like. We think it's a challenge to our individual freedom, and we think it's a kind of menacing, possibly authoritarian thing. Third, when it comes to cultural attitudes, there's an objection that the anti-racist activities that have been promoted in schools, in some schools in particular, are heavy-handed and over-personal. And that there's too much emphasis on getting white people to feel guilty. And there's too much excusing of problems that are related to the lives of people in color, political correctness, if you like, that you're not allowed to talk about. You're not allowed to talk about, there are a lot of people who commit crime, a disproportionate number of people who commit crimes are black. You're not allowed to say that. And so some of these objections have gotten very intense and have then become linked with relations between parents and school boards, or relations between parents and teachers, right? And Terry McAuliffe may have lost the last election when he said that parents had no business telling school boards what to do. So that's then, in other words, it plays into a continuing argument in our country about localism versus state power. And then I have to say this, which is, there's a context for the controversy. You could stand back in the case of Virginia and the gubernatorial election that we've just been through and say, well, they're not teaching in critical race theory in Virginia schools. What on earth is the controversy about? There are a few schools, districts, Loudoun County being one of them, and you can take a look at that article today, where there have been anti-racist programs, at least programs denominated anti-racist, put into effect in the schools, and it's caused some controversy. But for the most part, that has not been a subject of major controversy in most Virginia schools. So what is this about? Well, at some point you have to stand back and say we in America are experiencing the worst political tribalism that we've experienced probably at least since the 60s, and maybe since the 1850s. That is, the differences between us, what one of my colleagues in England, Oliver Ramsbottom, calls radical disagreement. The point where people not only disagree about the facts, they disagree about how the facts are to be determined. They're not speaking the same language, right? They're not reading the same papers, they're not looking at the same programs, they're not talking to each other, and they are digging into positions. One of them, well, I don't want to characterize those positions now. That would take forever, and you know them as well as I do. The red tribe and the blue tribe is what we've got. And so this particular controversy that we're talking about is one of a range of controversies that are dividing people into these, what I'm calling red and blue tribes. And what to do about that is something which is driving people like me, like conflict resolution people, fairly crazy. Now, we're trying to rethink what we are doing as conflict resolution specialists to make it relevant to the kind of increased intensity of conflict and also an increased danger of violence, of this becoming violent. And so we can talk about that in the discussion period if you like. We've got a few ideas, but we should have more. So let me conclude this this little wrap by saying that one of the things conflict resolution people understand, I think, and it can provide the basis for some further discussion, is that it's one thing to say, here is a vision of American history, let's say, which has a lot of truth in it, and we want to talk to people who don't agree with us about that vision and those truths. It's quite another thing to say to people, you should feel guilty, very guilty. And at least what we know is there are historical situations in which people have recognized their responsibility and have managed to make a distinction between guilt and responsibility. You know, I think my son lives in Berlin, and I talk to him about this all the time because he has just placed a stone in honor of one of our relatives who was killed in the Holocaust. And in a part of Berlin where there are many such stones, and the people there say, yes, it's a good thing to do this. We should never forget we were responsible for this, and yet they're not tortured by personal guilt about it. They recognize that they're implicated, but they're not implicated directly either as oppressors or as victims. So it's complicated, but it's been, in some ways, the most successful experiment of this kind that I know in getting people to recognize historic responsibility without being put up against the wall and made to feel ashamed. And I don't think we figured out how to do that yet in our country. Because I think personally that there is responsibility. I think myself that it's not simply a racial responsibility. It's not a question of are you white or are you black. At least in my views, it has more to do with the multiple forms of privilege, starting with economic privilege. And I fault the critical race theory people myself sometimes for not emphasizing the economic side of things as much as I think they should. How to get to this situation where we're doing a little bit better, and we're doing maybe even as well as Germany, in recognizing historical wrongs that we're implicated in, even though we perhaps shouldn't feel personally ashamed about, is is an issue. So let me stop right there and open it up to you. Happy to hear your, not just your questions, but your comments. You don't have to put this in the form of a question. You know, when you do questions, the first question is, isn't it true that? Yeah. Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is John Norquist. I've been exposed to some of these theories dating back to my law school days when I was heard of Derek Bell, and I worked for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, Department of Justice, and now I work for the Department of Defense. And I think a lot of what you say is correct, but there's also really you have to take a look at some other facts too. Like, for example, here in Fairfax County, we probably have the most diverse county probably in America. We've got Koreans, we've got Indians, we've got Hispanic people. And it's certainly, and I think for the most part, people live and work well with their neighbors. And I don't think there's any dispute. I really think that racism has declined significantly in this country. There's broad acceptance of interracial relationships. Black wealth is rising. And the point that I'd like to make is that this obsession with race can actually make racism worse. We've made a lot of progress. We passed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, we passed the Voting Rights Act, we've passed Fair Housing Act, we've eliminated poll taxes. We've made so much progress that I don't believe we can legitimately say that we have structural racism in this country. We talked a lot about police relationships, but I really think that police do have a difficult job but do not disproportionately kill for example, blacks more than other races. And then we also have to talk a lot about Asian success. We haven't said any word about Asian success, which is clear, and that I think the best explanation for the Asian success is due to their belief in hard work and higher education. So I don't think that things are quite as dark as things that you're saying. I think we've made a lot of progress in this country.
Okay, thank you for that comment. Yes.
I like to say that the revolution is fought for freedom. Freedom as a result of the Indian War, where the French and the English, the English accrued a lot of debt and tried to taxate the colonies. People came here for freedom, for that right to choose, to have a place to stand, to work, to make money without being taxed. Don't forget about the Boston Tea Party and America.
You're certainly right about that.
Well, that is the reason for freedom. I have a relative, Reverend Obadiah Holmes, who came here as an indentured servant from England for freedom of religion. I do believe that every color, culture, creed, religion has a right to inalienable rights in the whole world, and that's in America. And structure is another word for you to say law, isn't it?
It's another word for?
You're talking about social construction, legal reforms. Is that social structure through law, through laws? Is that what you mean when you say structure? Because I do believe there's a semantic issue in America that's a problem, and it starts in the media. Media uses sensationalism. I studied rhetoric and communications at the University of Virginia, and propaganda, by the way, was a big problem in Stalin, Nazi, Hitler, Germany. And it's a problem in America. Just the name critical race theory is racist in itself. It uses the word race. We're all humans. I don't care what color, culture, creed we are. And I think that's true. God would be that.
Okay, thank you. Other comments?
I just wanted to thank you for sharing your perspective with us and your wisdom. I read the 1619 Project, and I found it very eye-opening and giving me food for thought of how I might look at things differently and to apply critical thinking to what I look at. And I really liked your example of
Thank you.
I want to just piggyback on what Katie had to say. I totally agree with her, and I think our job, or I feel like my personal job, is to learn more, listen, understand, because there's just a lot of noise out there, and so here, just your philosophy, or like what you're teaching, what you're talking about, it helps clarify a lot of things. So I really appreciate your time doing this. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Again, I want to echo thanks for coming here and talking. This is a difficult topic. You covered a lot of interesting things. I think your point about post-Nazi Germany was right on. I've been there and found that, you know, they had a lot of contrition for what happened, even though, yes, there are still some people of that generation who were actually there, which would be comparable to someone who was a slaveholder back in the day. So you have a mixed population of the guilty and the generation that had nothing to do with it. But they do have a lot of contrition for what happened, and you know, it doesn't seem like it's going to happen again. There's small pockets of people. In your comments, you mentioned, I think one of the things you haven't yet discussed is you mentioned changing the system. So if you have to change constructs, what constructs, you know, we've passed a lot of laws. What constructs does CRT strive to change? I mean, you hear everything from, you know, redistribution of wealth to, you know, it's one thing to say, yeah, this happened, this history happened, going back 400 years or further. But what is the end result of this, other than just educating people? Because you hear things like the children are being separated in classrooms and told, you know, who's the oppressed and who's the oppressor. So you hear those things, and I think that's one of the things that has caused this conflict. Resolution expert, but you know, talk about those kinds of things. And so what is the goal? And you know, is it valid when you read it or you hear things about the division that's happening in this philosophy?
Very interesting question. So a lot of interesting comments. I'm going to make a couple of observations and then stop me if I'm going too long. And first observation is I have several colleagues who are studying conflict and looking at conflict from the point of view of narratives and what kinds of stories people tell about conflict. And of course, history is a story. And one of the things one of my colleagues, Sarah Cobb, points out in a book that she's written on this is that in a conflict situation, people's stories tend to become more and more melodramatic and more simplified, and they tend to boil down more and more to good guys versus bad guys. One side's totally evil, one side's totally good. And then people kind of lock themselves into their stories. And by the way, and I think everybody does this here. I'm not talking about conservatives. I'm talking about liberals too. I'm talking about everybody in a conflict does this. So the aim of the conflict resolution in that kind of situation is to produce what Sarah calls better formed stories or more complicated stories. And that involves trying to develop in yourself and in other people a toleration for ambiguity. An ability to say, you can even have opposites things that seem to be opposite be true at the same time. I had an argument with a student, a woman of color, a few months ago, who was really angry about Thomas Jefferson. And I think I had said I'd gone to visit Monticello. And well, she said, how do you like visiting that slave those slave quarters and that hypocrite Jefferson. And I said, yeah, well, I thought she was talking about the contradictions between being a slave owner and participating in that society and being the author of all people are created equal, right? But no, she was talking about Sally Hemings. And that Jefferson, he raped this, slave. And I had to say, I don't
Is
think...
that the impression that men have of women? Or not just
I don't,
men?
yes, and I said, I think we ought to stop right there, I have to even stop you right there and say, we don't actually know what the relationship was.
Well, a man over a woman,
Right.
that causes a baby.
That's a way to stereotype any relationship. It's like stereotyping racially. So the first thing I wanted to say is, actually, we don't know what Hemings' relationship with Jefferson
I don't
was.
make an impression at all.
It may have been a loving relationship between people can be very unequal socially and have a loving relationship. We don't know. So what I was saying to her, and I got in trouble for it, was don't assume that because he's a man, she's a woman, he's white, she's black, he's a slave owner,
Exactly.
and she's a
That's
slave, right? Don't assume that you know what the relationship is like, right? Let's consider the possible ambiguity. Novelists consider this all the time. I mean, that's why I teach a course in conflict and literature, because that's where you, I think, get a lot of this sort of understanding that things just don't fit don't fit the stereotype all the time. And I remember I was taught by a wonderful guy in college who wrote a book called, way back then, called Race and Nationality in American Life. And he was talking about Jefferson's Notes on Virginia. I mean, in Jefferson's Notes on Virginia, he talks about the black population and the Native American, the Indian population. And he says, well, some people say they're not human, but they are human, he says. But, he says, I think they were created separately. I think they're the result of separate creations. So first God created the whites, and then he created, or whatever the order was. So, this author's name, by the way, is Oscar Hanlon, said, why would Jefferson, the great Democrat, have talked about separate creations? And he said, because he was an 18th century European. And for an 18th century upper class, relatively speaking, European man, being rational in a certain way, acting a certain way, is what made you a person. And what made you a man or a woman like us. And people who acted differently. Remember, people didn't have much contact across cultures. People who acted very much differently. Jefferson was trying to figure this out. How can they be human but not act like an 18th century Englishman or Frenchman? He just said separate creations was the answer to that problem for him.
But today we don't live like that.
But you can see how difficult it's still very difficult for people to understand folks from a different civilization, and you can see it all the time. So the other thing I wanted to say about this was that it seems also to me that often when you see people being angry, getting extremely angry in a controversy like the one that we've been discussing, then one of the things you can do is ask, where's the anger coming from if it's not just the result of this controversy? And you can, looking at our country today, you can ask that about a lot of people. Where is all the fear and anger coming from?
Technology.
People, and I think technology is one answer. People fear they fear they're losing their freedom, right? And in many cases, they have lots to complain about, but are blocked by various kinds of taboos from thinking about what the sources of that oppression are. Right? If you're not allowed to think an unpatriotic thought, then you're going to find a scapegoat and say it's their fault. Right? If our town, and I just came back from visiting some relatives in Louisiana, they got some trouble down there, I want to tell you. And then people say, well, if this town basically has no social services, and everybody's in debt, and lots of people are on opioids, and I mean, there's all kinds of bad stuff happening here. But if we're not allowed to say that there's something wrong with the way the system is operating to produce these results, then it has to be we're sinners, and that's the only way to explain it. Or it can be it's the immigrants, or it's the whites, or it's the blacks, or it's the men, or it's the women that are causing this, because we're not allowed to we've kind of been trained out of recognizing that some of the sources of these problems are internal to the way we do business in the U.S.
Some of it's also personal get up and go initiative.
So that's I think I'm out of time.
That's right. Sorry. Hey, let's give a hand to Dr.